Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to this morning's breakfast briefing. Lovely to see so many people here with us this morning. Bore da chi gyd, croeso mawr I chi bore yma, wastad yn braf cael eich cwmni chi ar y boreau fel hyn. My name is John Parry-Jones, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you here this morning to our breakfast briefing. A thrill for me. It's the first time I've been back doing one of these briefings for over 2 years. I missed last month because of COVID, so it's lovely to see so many familiar faces here. Great to see so many people have been able to join us online as well this morning. For me to paint a picture of what we have here, if you look through, one of the cameras is set up as Exec Ed camera. You can see the people we've got in the room with us this morning. We also, to my right, have a screen that did have everybody's faces on it, but it seems to have overridden at the moment. So if you do want to turn your cameras on, if you feel confident enough to turn your cameras on this morning, if you're online, then please do. It'd be lovely to have a fully hybrid interactive event this morning. So this morning we're going to be looking at inflation and the cost of living crisis. It could hardly be a more topical subject to discuss. You turn on the news every day and this seems to be the main topic of discussion. Professor Hugh Dixon is with us this morning. Hugh approached Sarah and me back in November and suggested that April and May might be an opportune time to run this briefing, and he was absolutely spot on in terms of his timing. So we're really pleased that Hugh is able to be with us and that he promoted this the idea for us. We then wondered who we could get to host or to chair the event for us, and Sarah Dickins' name cropped up, and we thought, well, Sarah would never come along to one of our breakfast briefings. But if you don't ask, you don't get. And Sarah, thank you so much for joining us this morning. It adds a huge amount to our event. We're really grateful. Sarah's the BBC Wales economics correspondent, yes? So really pleased that Sarah could be with us this morning. Now, before I hand over, for those of you who are online this morning, don't forget that our speech-to-text captioning is available. If you click on the subtitling button, I think it is at the bottom of your screen, you'll be able to follow the captioning, which may aid your enjoyment this morning. It will just enable you to follow everything that's the whole discussion during the course of this morning. I'd also like to bring to your attention one or two of the events that we've got coming up over the course of the next few weeks. We have our next briefing, breakfast briefing on Tuesday, the 14th of June, where Sarah Elson from the Tria Nelson, sorry, my eyesight's going. Tria Nelson from the Development Bank of Wales is going to join us to discuss equity finance as a driver for economic development in Wales. Now, in 2020, a record 129 million equity investment was made into small businesses and startups in Wales. 20,000 new companies were set up, which were both record. Those two figures were both record figures in Wales. And Trian is going to join us to discuss how that came to a close 2 years ago, how COVID impacted on those numbers, and also to see what opportunities there are for investing in the future. So that should be a really interesting event for us. And then in July, on the 7th of July, a full day session that will be here. The breakfast briefing will be hybrids in the same way as this one. The blockchain immersion with Professor Yingli Wang is going to be a session which will be held here, be held in two parts, looking at blockchain. We also have two guests from Italy coming over, two experts in that field coming over to speak with us. Looking at blockchain technologies, two modules covering the basics of blockchain theory and definitions for non-technical people like me, but also an afternoon session then looking at more detailed case analysis on how blockchain can be used. So if that's a field that's of interest to you, there'll be limited numbers, so please do join us and keep an eye out for those registration details. Our Lean Six Sigma Yellow Belt courses are always popular. We seem to be running them from one month to the next. We have another session, another 2 days in a couple of weeks' time. If you want to take an opportunity to review or improve your business processes, this may be the program for you. This is likely to be, I think, the last one that we do online, not guaranteed, but it may be the last one that we do online. So if you're outside Cardiff and you want to take advantage of that 2-day program, then please do get in touch with one of us here. We always discuss our bespoke programs. If now's the time for you to start looking at running a training program for yourself or your company or your organization, then please do get in touch. We have so much academic resource here in the business school. We can put together, we can tailor a program depending on your needs. So please do get in touch with Sarah or with me so that we can look at that for you and assist you in your training requirements. The Help to Grow programme, Linda's here this morning. We discussed Help to Grow last month at our breakfast briefing as well. This is a great 12-week programme, intense programme for SMEs. Opportunities to learn from our academics, opportunities to share ideas and thoughts with your peer groups, also opportunities to deal and communicate with mentors who will be allocated to you. So if you've got any interest in that, it's a really good programme sponsored mainly by the government. Please do get in touch with Linda or with one of us in the team. Just a reminder, this morning is being recorded. The event this morning is being recorded. We also have Mike here. So for those of you who are in the suite this morning, Mike's taking photographs just for you to be aware of that. If you have any questions, if you're in the suite here, if you do have any questions, please just raise your hand. We'll bring the microphone out to you. If you can wait for the microphone so that everybody at home can hear the question. If you can introduce yourself as well, that would be useful so that people at home are aware who's asking the question. If you're online and you have a question, please do pop the questions into the chat function, and we'll probably ask you to unmute yourselves and ask the questions yourselves. We have such a hot topic here this morning, and you have two subject matter experts here. So please don't miss the opportunity to pose any questions that you would choose, primarily to Hugh, but I'm sure Sarah will deal with any questions as well. So on that note, I'm going to hand over to you, Sarah. Thank you again for looking after us this morning. I'm going to leave it with you for the next 3/4 of an hour or so.
Thank you. Well, Bore da, good morning. It's so nice to know that so many of you have taken the time to be with us in some shape or form, either online or here in the room today. And as John was saying, what a pertinent day this is to have this discussion. The Queen's speech will be focusing on the cost of living crisis today. And I don't know about you guys, but I was asked to be involved in this a long time ago, when actually inflation was interesting. I was interested in it. It was affecting people, but it wasn't kind of the issue. And wow, week by week, month by month, hasn't this become the issue of the time, and very much discussed on the doorstep? We're told in the elections that there were last week, for instance. Now, John said we had two experts here. I'm not an economist. I see my job, hopefully I'm an expert journalist, but I see my job as interpreting what people like Hugh understand and talk about. And I suppose the other thing is, where I'm very lucky with my job, is that I get to talk about these subjects with people. And I must say, the level of anxiety about inflation, the level of anxiety about how people are going to just plain manage is really enormous at the moment. And you really feel it. And it's not just those people who are most vulnerable, which up till now, most of the government policy has supported those people. It's right across the board. So many people are worried about how they're going to pay the next bill. And it was interesting, I don't know if any of you were listening to the radio this morning. Radio 4 had on there a guy who runs a prepayment meter business. And he was saying the number of people that they've had being in touch with them struggling is huge. And he was saying families need an extra £1,000 a year and need help. Now, so the alarm bells are being rung loud, not just for, say, caring organisations and charities, but right through the economy, that this is something that we really are all grappling with. And I'm sure you know it as well. I think we've got kind of used to the idea that something was £1.50, it'd be £1.50. It took me back to my childhood when actually things went up quite steeply at one point. And, now I think for a whole generation, and for lots of us that have forgotten about inflation, it is a day-to-day thing. Whereas that was something that we'd kind of parked in our brain. Also, I think, we need to put this in the context of climate change as well. Climate change was the big issue for the economy. How are we going to decarbonize? How are we going to have a more circular economy? What were we going to do about that? The cost of living crisis has kind of overtaken this in terms of the media. Obviously, climate change hasn't gone away, and neither have the challenges for the economy. And I think it'd be interesting to hear how Hugh sees those two playing together. So I speak to people, I hear their pain. And just one very small little detail, which I would imagine as kind of urban types as you are. I live on a farm. You might not know this, but so you can tell your friends this over coffee. Red diesel, the diesel that goes into tractors, has gone up by even more than the diesel in our cars. It's more than doubled. So just think about it. the diesel being used to get potatoes out of the ground, to cut the grain, to do all that work on farms that's starting now and through the summer and into the autumn, that is costing those farmers twice as much, just that. So I don't know. I'm not an economist. I don't know like Hugh does. But even I can see that if we think we've got inflation now, surely it's going to get steeper as those things come through the economy. But let's hear from the experts. Let's give a nice warm welcome to Professor Hugh Dixon.
This is working. Thank you very much for that, Sarah. So inflation. So I just want to give a fairly, there's going to be 3 parts. I'm going to say how we got here, where we are, and where we're going. I won't be able to go into much detail. So hopefully you can bring up anything you want to talk about in the questions. And thank you for coming. So the first thing, where are we? Well, inflation is increasing across the world. And so our level of inflation increased from 0.7% in March 2021, just over a year ago, to 7.2% in March this year. That's the latest figure we have. Inflation statistics are published a month in advance, and April's figures will come out in a couple of weeks' time. And indeed, for the April one that's announced on May the 18th, it could be more than 9%, possibly. It could be a very big increase. The reason I think this might be the case is because the Bank of England, in its recent forecast, said something pretty much that implied that it could be 9% plus in April. Now, it's similar across many countries. Not all countries are the same. It's happening, inflation happened a bit earlier in the US and so on. Here's a range of countries. We're here, GB. Spain, it's a bit higher. Germany, it's a bit higher. Japan, it's low. Japan and China, it's still fairly low. So there's a different story across the world, but it's certainly, I think it'll set to increase in China and Japan. It's just a matter of timing, really, for the reasons I'll explain. So it's bad here, but it's even worse in some places, and it's a little bit better in some others. Okay, so what are the 4 main factors? How did we get here? Now, this is very, very overview. So each one of these, I could give a lecture on each one of these. But firstly, restarting after the pandemic, we had a very sharp drop in output during the pandemic. You'll recall, we've been coming back. So that's one factor. A second factor is restructuring after the pandemic. So the way we spend money, the way people spend money has changed quite dramatically. Very simply, we spend more stuff on things and less on services. But there's been a huge restructuring of how we spend our money. And this differentiates the recovery from this recession, the pandemic, from the great financial crisis. After the great financial crisis, we're basically doing pretty much what we were doing before the great financial crisis. And one of the main items here would be, for example, online services. There's been a rapid increase in online purchases and so on. So now 30% of our purchases are made online, whereas before the pandemic, it was 20%. 3, labor shortages. Habits have changed. We've got used to more leisure now. There's been a great resignation. People have thought about what they're doing and they've just changed what they want to do. They don't want to commute so often into work or for long distances and so on and so forth. Lots of details there. But the end story is we've got labor shortages now. Basically, people need to change and change where they're working. And of course, we've got the additional Brexit factor in the UK. But of course, as I've just shown, the labor shortages are pretty much universal in the Western world, at least. Lastly, energy prices. I'll come back a little bit more to these. But really, if you look at 2 and 3, the restructuring the labor shortages, what these have really shown to us is how everything is linked together in the world economy. It's like the matrix. All sectors are linked. I'll come back to what I mean by the matrix, but certainly everything is linked. And if you have shortages in one sector, it affects everything else. Okay. For energy, I'll just say you can exaggerate what's going on in energy. So petrol prices, they are higher now. I just filled my tank for, I think it was 160 a litre. So that's the highest price. But if you adjust for inflation, petrol prices were actually higher back in 2007, 2010. We've had very high petrol prices before, if you adjust for inflation. And indeed, if you look at oil, well, oil is actually cheaper now than it was in 2007. Oil was $150 a barrel. And I think it's 100 or 110 now. So some of these things, energy is very volatile, it goes up and down. But there are some new things which have happened. And partly there's been a shift in the way that we produce. There's been a shift to renewables. There's more wind and solar now and less nuclear. And I think some countries, particularly Germany, were a bit caught out in their transition to greener energy. They phased stuff out maybe a little bit too rapidly before the new energy sources had come into play. And of course, the thing with energy is you've got to think a long way ahead. It takes many years to build a new power station and so on and so forth. So I think some countries were sort of caught out by that. As a result, there's been a huge increase in demand for natural gas to generate electricity, both in the piped form in some countries or as liquefied natural gas. That's energy. So, and then of course, as we were hearing, people were expecting inflation to peak in April with the rise in the off-gem price cap. But of course, we've also got the Ukraine has come across here now. So we've got the war in the Ukraine, the physical war that's going on, the tragic war that we can see on television. And we've also got the sanctions. The Western countries have responded to that by imposing sanctions. So the direct effects, we've got supply in the Ukraine. Ukraine produces lots of things, but the relevant ones are wheat, fertilizer, and neon as well. Neon's very important for making microchips and so on. And also, of course, the closure of the Black Sea ports. So Sarah was just telling me that the port of Odessa, there's wheat ready to be exported from there. And clearly, even Russian wheat can't be exported through the Black Sea ports. So that's had a direct effect. But there's also the indirect effects. Okay, the West has sanctioned Russia to try and reduce the sales of Russian goods, energy, and so on to themselves. So that's also having an effect. And of course, that may reduce total exports. We can come back to that, and hence the world supply. But if it does work and reducing Russian exports, it'll reduce world supply, and that can have a further impact on inflation. And the things that energy does, it's oil, natural gas, and coal, which we've all heard about. Also wheat, it's a very major producer of wheat. Fertilizer is a very key thing as well, which is used by farmers all over the world. But there's also lots of minerals and metals. There's a whole list of things. I never knew that Russia supplied so much stuff until a few weeks ago. Lastly, there's China's zero COVID policy. We're all here. There's a few of us wearing masks, but not really. It's all sort of game over here, more or less, isn't it? But in China, they're still pursuing the zero COVID policy. And of course, that was very successful in the first wave back in 2020. Very few people died in China. And I think along with Germany, there are a few countries which had a very successful first wave. In Britain, we had a terrible first wave, of course. But of course, now they're still following the same policy of isolating people, track and trace, and so on. It may have worked before, but now we have Omicron, highly infectious variants. And so I don't think it's going to work myself. It's become a lot more difficult to implement. But whether they're right or wrong, we'll leave that aside. It's clearly going to have a major effect on supply linked with China. And we've already seen big lockdowns in Shanghai and so on. And that's going to continue to affect the whole world because of China's importance in international trade. Okay, so where were we going? So before the Ukraine, I'll say inflation was set to peak in April with the off-gem price gap increase to around 7 to 8%. That's what most people thought. After the Ukraine, inflation is going to be rising faster. It's already started rising faster since February, and in April, as I say, it may reach 9%. The Bank of England certainly are predicting it'll peak towards the end of 2022 at about 10%, and it'll remain quite high for another year. Here's my forecast. I don't know if you can see that, but each month when they introduce the inflation, the new inflation figures, I have a little forecast which I update each month, published by NISA, the National Institute for Economic and Social Research in London, and it looks a bit like that. So you can see there's a red line. The yellow line is the Bank of England's target, a long way away, and the red line there that goes up, that's on the left-hand side of the grey dotted line is what we know has happened. And you can see, as I say, inflation's increased from quite a low level in the past up to its current level of 7.2% in March. And then you've got a series of scenarios on the right. So the bottom scenario, a bit irrelevant, but that's what would happen if inflation came in line with the Bank of England's target of 2% per year. So inflation will be coming down. And then the other three lines are under different scenarios, higher scenarios and higher scenarios. So The highest scenario I had before the Ukraine was 7.9%, saying that inflation might peak at 7.9%. But since the Ukraine, it's gone up a bit. I've upped it up a bit, and it peaks at 9.8% in January 2023, which is fairly similar to what the Bank of England's sort of saying. So that gives you an idea. So we've sort of moved, if you like, because of the Ukraine, we've moved from the blue line to the red line. In previous times, the expectations going forward might have been even lower. So we're here, inflation is going to be here for a long time, for at least another year at this current high levels. And I don't think there's very much the government can do about that. So that's going to have a major impact on us, as we'll see. So it's a cost of living crisis. This has been the main focus. It's a cost of living crisis. Why is it a cost of, well, as an economist, we tend to think inflation is the cost of living. But I agree, inflation, it sounds like the City of London, people in suits talking about inflation and stock markets and things. So nothing to do with us, is it? Whereas the cost of living sounds like it's something, stuff we buy in shops. In fact, they're the same thing, but why is it being called a cost of living crisis? Well, it's because of food and energy are the two main drivers of this, I think. And in recent months, food and energy have seen particularly big increases. In fact, food is a little bit of the dog that didn't bark. The United Nations was warning about a food crisis right back in the pandemic. They were saying there'd be a food shortage in 2020, at the end of 2020. It never really came up, although we have to remember in lots of parts of the world, there are food shortages almost all the time, of course. But we don't see that in the West. But I think for some of the reasons that Sarah was saying, farmers are finding things very tough now. The cost of fertilizer is going up, the diesel's going up. There's a real problem in food supply in the world. And the war and sanctions, because Ukraine and Russia are two major suppliers of wheat, I think between them it's something like 40% of wheat, and the fertilizer, it's going to have quite a big effect. And we haven't felt that effect yet. The effect will be felt when the harvest doesn't turn up or it's much smaller in a few months' time. But prices have already been rising in anticipation of what's happening. People have seen this happening, and they've been trying to buy up fertilizer and the components of that. And of course, it's a cost of living crisis. It affects the poorer households, both locally in Wales, in the UK, and across the world. And of course, we talk about poorer households, it's poorer countries as well. This effect of this is going to be much worse in poorer countries. If you're spending half your income or 3/4 of your income on food and food goes up, then that's a major problem. The share of food in our income for most households in the UK is a lot less than that. But for the poorest households, it is quite high. So it's affecting the poorer households, and there are a lot of poorer households in poorer countries, but there are also poorer households here as well. So it's going to affect poorer households more than richer households. So will wages keep up? So if you go back to the 70s, we were talking about alluding to the 70s. Well, I don't know if you remember the 70s. I was around then as well. We had a wage price spiral. Prices went up, wages were going up, and some people did lose out, but a lot of people didn't. Wages sort of more or less kept up with inflation, more or less. There was an incomes policy as well, but that's history. But I think the answer, probably not. Most of us will become poorer. The reason really being that the increase in energy prices acts like a fall in productivity. The sort of value added which an industry or a service is supplying will go down because part of the intermediate product, what goes into that, is becoming more expensive. So it makes us less productive in an economic sense. And so real income of many households will fall, and what happens if your income falls? You reduce your consumption. So discretionary consumption will tend to fall. We'll be spending more on energy and food, things that we have to spend money on, and we'll spend less on other things. So that's it. So, and we're going to have much less growth. So the Bank of England, the report they did publish just last week, they think there's going to be roughly zero growth in 2023, whereas before they thought it was going to be growing a couple of percent. But of course, it's going to be a mixed story. There'll be winners and losers. There always are. So some people will have big pay increases, or some people will make a lot of money during the inflationary period. But I think on balance, it'll be losers. In the longer run, however, I've got to put something. Generally, I think things will catch up. We will, in the longer run, I put 5 to 10 years, though it might be even sooner. Wages will probably catch up. but it doesn't look like they'll catch up in the near future. What can the government do? Well, here it's a little bit more, it's a little bit difficult. So I will say a few things. Firstly, they can redistribute. Okay, so they can raise taxes to pay for increased payments to poorer or lower income households. So they can take money from the rich and give it to the poor, a bit like Robin Hood. So that's one thing they can do. They can redistribute. What sort of taxes can they do? Well, they can raise taxes on higher income households. They can have a property or a wealth tax, or they could have a corporate windfall tax. And the corporate windfall tax is particularly attractive, not necessarily to our current government, but it's being done in other countries, because energy companies are making a killing here. They're making a lot of money because the price of energy is going up and they're supplying energy. So they're making quite high profits. And so there has been a suggestion that there should be a corporate windfall tax. So that's one thing that could happen. So raise taxes and you redistribute. The second thing is you can borrow more. The government can borrow more. I mean, we've seen governments borrowing a lot in the past, particularly during the pandemic, but they were borrowing before that as well. Now, this actually isn't as reckless as you might think, because, of course, inflation actually acts like a tax on households. If you've got money in a bank, it's going down in value. And so in fact, it's just like paying a tax, if you like. So there's an inflation tax. And the government, it reduces the real value of government debt, what the government owes to us and to people in general. So in a sense, inflation is a way of the government paying back effortlessly some of its debt. So in a sense, this provides some scope for them to borrow more without raising the debt to GDP ratio. So you can measure the affordability of government debt by how it relates to GDP or the income in the economy, because tax revenue is linked to the GDP. So inflation, because it acts like a tax, it actually creates some space for the government to borrow more. But it is a dangerous, it's potentially a poison chalice, because borrowing doesn't really solve the underlying problem, which is a supply problem. If we go back to that, we're talking about supply problems here. And it doesn't mean, if the government borrows money, it doesn't make more food or energy available. And it could just increase demand and lead to more inflation. So that's a caveat there. So it's a bit of a, they've got to be very careful with that if they do not to do too much. So that's two of the things that the UK government could do. If we look at the Welsh Government, of course, that has far fewer powers. It can redistribute to some extent, a little bit. Obviously, it has less ability to raise taxes, and the benefits or the welfare system is driven by at the UK level. However, it does have some things it can do. It's got rates, the land transfer tax, and so on. So it can influence things a little bit at the margins, but it would be very much at the margins rather than having a major effect. It can redirect as well. It can make sure the poor get more resources out of what their existing budget is. But again, this isn't really as easy because existing budgets in Wales are already overstretched. We only have to look at schools and the health services. But certainly they can redirect things by targeting at the poorest, by things like food banks and direct energy payments. So I think there are some things the Welsh Government can do, but not much. The UK government can do a lot more, but even the UK government has relatively little power to influence things, I think. Every little helps, though. So what sort of things could they do? I wanted to end on a bit of a practical note. Well, basically, they need to encourage food production. We're going to have a big world food shortage quite soon. Britain imports most of its food. Now, we're a rich country, so we can probably, hopefully, buy in some food to keep us going. But that will be at the expense of food in the rest of the world. And, we really need to encourage food production in the UK and Wales. What can the government do? It can relax regulations, red tape as a temporary emergency measure, give tax breaks linked to food production. It can do some stuff in the short run, whatever it can, to try and make sure that our harvests this year are as large as possible. Secondly, it can reduce food waste. We waste a huge amount of food. I think it's 25% of food is wasted at various different stages of production. And really having something to reduce food wastage will be very, very useful. Rationing of food. Now, this is an emergency measure. It's probably unlikely to happen in the UK, but it certainly will be happening in some countries. But why would you have rationing? Well, it's to ensure a fairer allocation of scarce food. If you don't ration, then people with money will buy food and they'll be quite happy, even though it costs more. And the people who will end up without food will be the poor. And this has always been the case. One of my old professors at Oxford, Amartya Sen, one of his studies, one of his specialities was on famines. And indeed, he lived through the great famine in Bengal back in the late 1940s, just before independence. And he made the point that very few famines, it's actually the shortage of food that matters. It's the allocation of food across households. There's nearly always been enough food. It's simply that if you leave it to the free market, people without money lose access to food and hence run into really serious problems. So we need to avoid that happening, certainly in this country, but also across the world. Energy, well, that's a much harder one to crack because obviously it's harder to help in the short run because energy policy is driven by much longer term things. You mentioned climate change. Also, building new power stations takes a lot of time, so it's much harder to influence that in the short run. But certainly we can get people to use energy more efficiently. Back to the 70s, we did have power cuts at some stage, and I think we've seen power cuts more recently in California several years ago, and we've seen them in China more recently. So there are sorts of things that can be done, and we can certainly make it easier perhaps for new suppliers to start up and supply energy. But however, I don't think there's very much that can be done in the short run to help us out on the energy front. It's more of a long-term tool. Okay, so just my final thoughts before I open it up, and we're very welcome to go into as much detail as you like on many of these things. We were just getting over the supply chain problems in January and February. They'd lasted longer than we thought. I mean, originally people thought it might last 3 or 6 months. It had gone on, but things were just starting to get better. And then the war came in the Ukraine. So if it hadn't been for the war in the Ukraine, then inflation would probably be on a downward path by now. We'd be saying April, probably after April, in May, it'll be getting better, and that's it. But unfortunately, that doesn't seem to be the case. The war and the sanctions are raising energy and food prices, and through energy, everything, because energy is involved in everything. And of course, we've got China's zero COVID policy. So we wait to see how long they'll keep on with that policy. So government policy, governments need to focus on the poorest in society who'll be hardest hit. It will hit everybody, but some of us are more able to afford it than other people. And so we really need to focus on those who are hardest hit. But lastly, there's just great uncertainty. So, I showed you the diagram with the little dotted lines, but certainly it's very much uncertainty. So the sorts of things that matter: when and how will the war in Ukraine end? And if it ends, when will sanctions finish? Some people are already talking about sanctions going on after the war ends. When will China abandon its zero COVID policy? All of these are issues which will really determine when the supply shortages will sort of ease. They will ease in the longer run, but whether it lasts a year or 2 years, that's the real question, I think, that we face now. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Hugh. And it was really interesting to hear, the various threads and the way that, this is all woven together to get to where we are now. And, thanks for that. And I think it really explained and showed us how global this is, not just as a problem, but how so many global issues are coming together at the same time. Now, this isn't all about me. It would be lovely to have questions from you guys and everyone who's joining us online as well. So just chip in whenever you want to. Hands up here, messages if you're joining us online. But one thing I think, Hugh, lots of us might have thought, oh, really? Is when that you said that oil actually is cheaper now than it was. What did you say, 2007? I think that was a real surprise. So how come we didn't have a problem then?
We did have a problem. Inflation, just before the great financial crisis, inflation was at 5%. So we did have a problem. There was a lot of things happening with global commodity crisis. So inflation went up, but then the great financial crisis came and inflation collapsed almost straight away.
It's just we've forgotten that one. We've got short minds, haven't we?
We've got short memories, that's right. Yes, and that's why I wanted to remind you about it.
Yeah, it's good to be reminded. And I think also one of the other things is that we cast our minds back to other times when there's been inflation. And one of the things that there's been high unemployment. Whereas now we have a situation, don't we, where we have low productivity, low unemployment. So there's no growth, there's very little growth going on. And we've got this inflation. It seems, that doesn't go along with sort of A-level economics and what governments do, does it?
No, it is a big difference. Although I was saying there's a labour supply shortage, it's still the case that there's a lot of people working and we don't have this unemployment. And in fact, it was one of the great mysteries of the pandemic, if you like, why we didn't get unemployment. People were forecasting we'd have 8 or 10% unemployment, quite high unemployment in the depth of the pandemic, but it never happened. And it's still quite low now. I think the Bank of England saying it will come back. But why is that? Well, I think it's just people can't afford to be unemployed. It may sound a silly thing to say, but I think people have to work somehow, and because they have to cover their rent, they have to cover all the necessities of life, housing costs and so on. So I think it's just much more difficult for people to be unemployed now for a lot of people, and that's really they've found a job, they've managed to find work somehow, but it doesn't. We've got the working poor with us back again. I think that's the new phenomenon that we have. We have people who are in jobs, they're working, but they still can't. They can only just break even, which is a relatively new phenomenon, although it's always been there, I suppose.
But productivity, presumably, in theory, increase the productivity of the country, the value of when we go to work, and then that should help that. But it's hard to see where we're going to get any growth.
Well, yes, productivity. Well, we've had the great productivity stop, if you like. So since the great financial crisis, productivity in the UK has been more or less completely flat. It used to grow at 2% a year. So we had rising real wages and GDP was rising, but it's been pretty flat. And as I say, the effect of the energy prices, at least in the short run, is to actually reduce measured productivity. So yeah, we're adding a problem, if you like, onto something which was already stagnant. So we haven't really had much productivity growth since 2008.
You can probably see where I'm leading. So we have very little growth and we have very big inflation. And then that's that other wonderful word, stagflation. I mean, that sends alarm bells in terms of people steering economies. But do you think that we're getting anywhere near that kind of risk, the kind of thing that countries get stuck into for years, don't they? Because it's so hard to get out of, where there's high inflation and no growth.
I think the high inflation problem, if we end up in a wage price spiral, it is possible, it's not impossible that we could go back to something like in the 1970s. But that would require wages to rise. And I say it's very difficult. We talk about the fog of war in the Ukraine, but it's very difficult to interpret wage data at the moment because there's been a big change in the composition, who's working. So although the average wage figures actually show average wages are rising quite well, a lot of people think this is just a composition effect, that a lot of lower paid jobs disappeared during the pandemic. And so that if you get rid of lower paid jobs, it raises the average. And that's a composition effect. So it's very difficult to disentangle what's happening. But I think if you compare like for like, I think wages aren't growing that well. Although, of course, there are exceptions. Some people are getting big pay increases, but I don't think academics are getting pay increases, are we, Sarah? No.
So the big pay increases are things like long-distance lorry drivers, aren't they? Because there used to be a lot of Eastern Europeans doing those jobs. Something
like that, yes.
So Brexit, really, whatever one thinks of Brexit, whether they think it's wonderful or not,
yes,
it has, would you say, taken a significant number of people out of the labour market?
Yes, I think the figure I saw was something like 1 million people who left and who haven't come back. But I mean, some of them may come back in the future, so it's hard to say. But Brexit clearly had a contractionary effect on labour supply. But I say these problems are not limited to Britain. They're all over Europe. So those people are in Europe now, and they still have inflation in Europe, even with the extra people. So we can't exaggerate the effect of Brexit, but certainly it hasn't helped. It hasn't helped matters at all.
Yeah, and there are moves that are being done by both the UK and the Welsh Government to help the most vulnerable. And obviously, they're the people, as you were saying, who will fear it most. Because a larger proportion of their income is spent on the basics. Yeah, that's the basics, food and energy that are going up. But presumably, if this continues, then your kind of classic average family where both work and they've got all sorts of direct debits, you know, there's the subscription for Netflix and Disney and the phone thing and the insurance, and because we've become quite a financialized society, haven't we? Those families are going to feel it as well in the way that they did in 2008.
Yes, I think that's right. So people are further up the scale are going to, you know, further up the income or distribution will feel this quite heavily, whereas before it would have been very much the poorest households. Yes, I think that's right. And I think that's partly because housing costs have got so great. So the amount that people are spending on rents and so on, particularly, and remember that people don't buy their houses till they're much older nowadays.
But they can't afford to.
They can't afford to, no. So so a lot of people are living in rented accommodation and rents are going pretty much crazy. So if you look at people's, even before this crisis, if you looked at the ONS data, if you looked at the median household, this average household, they hadn't got any better off for about 15 or 20 years if you subtract off housing costs. So I think, you know, housing costs were creating a real drag on a lot of families. You know, it's just living somewhere is very expensive nowadays, whereas 20, 30, 40, you know, in the 70s, you could go a squat. You could just walk into a house and with a sleeping bag. And there
you can't do that anymore.
Yeah, you can't do that anymore. You know, there were. It's just become much more expensive just to live anywhere now.
A senior politician was on the radio this morning saying that the answer would be to lower income tax, which is an interesting one. I'd not heard a politician say that until today. What would that work? Lowering income tax? I mean, in theory, it puts more money in the pockets, but is it putting in the money in the pockets of the right people?
That's Plan B. That's Plan B, borrowing more, basically. So yes, you could cut taxes. That would give more money to people. But as I say, giving more money to people doesn't solve the supply problem. That there's not enough stuff to go around. So you know, you need to increase the supply. And just giving people more money, it could just generate more inflation because more people are going along with their money to compete for the same goods, and the prices will go up. So I think cutting income tax, and also it's not necessarily redistributing; it's putting it across a wide range of people. It's helping everybody, if you like it. You know, it'll help me. I'm quite happy if they cut income tax, no problem. But you know, I'm not going to be having problems paying my energy bills or food bills. So you know, I think it's not really directed at people who are going to be most hit cutting income tax, although it's always popular with voters, particularly of certain parties. Which
and you know, you alluded to it just now. It really is the case now, isn't it? Where let's say a family where there's two earners, they're still finding it very hard. Two full-time earners finding it very hard to make ends meet, and that, in theory, isn't what's meant to happen. It's meant to be, you know, you're told at school, aren't you? Work hard, get a job, you'll be okay. You know, but that seems to be the case now. You can work very, very hard, two people, and find it hard to pay the bills. How do we get out of that? How do we get out of that kind of cycle? Because obviously, if they earned more, they'd spend more, and that would help the corner shop. How do we get more kind of activity into the economy?
Well, again, everything is linked, if you like. But I think one of the things in Britain, we've had a housing crisis for as long as I can remember. Governments just don't really seem able to deal with this issue of providing adequate housing. Because I think that's one.
Do you think that's one of the biggest things then?
Well, it's a long one. It's a long run thing. Obviously, it's not behind the current crisis, but I think it's, as I say, in the last 20 or 30 years, it's really beginning to bite that housing is taking the bottom decile. Well, not the bottom, the one above it, just above it. The poorer households spend 25% of their income on housing and related and stuff. It's a very big proportion. And you know, younger people, you know, your students or people in their first jobs, you know, you're often paying quite large proportions of their income. Now, so and that is relatively new. I mean, so I think solving the housing problem, and the way to solve the housing problem is having more houses. The problem is that government after government, you need to build houses where people live, and a lot of people live in the southeast, and you know, governments for various reasons have been very reluctant to build new towns and new housing in certain parts of the country where they need it. So that's one thing. But the other thing is to try and improve productivity. And there's been a lot of work on that, but of course that's all sort of gone by the board at the moment. But again, it's a longer run thing. But if you can try and get productivity back by various means, but that's only going to be much a long-term policy.
Yeah, that again will take a long time to work through, won't it? Because I mean, it was only about a year ago we heard lots of headlines about green growth and public sector investment into green jobs that then would be paid more, et cetera, and help in terms of the climate crisis. That seems to have gone away, but that actually would grow the economy, would it not? And therefore help families. I know we're talking about inflation this morning, but help families cope with the inflation.
Yes, and I think the actual current crisis, because it's raising fossil fuel prices, it will actually have benefit green energy quite a lot. So it will, but it'll take a bit of time for that to filter through. So I think there is a big potential for improvements in the green economy, if you like, and things like electric cars and things like that. This will all be speeded up by the current crisis, definitely. But it's not going to help you this year or next year. You know, it'll be something that will come along 4 or 5 years' time, that sort of time horizon, I think.
If you're itching for a question, just stick your hand. Oh, look, like magic. Hello.
Yeah, I'm Stephen Evans from the Bevan Foundation. I just wanted to pick back up on the discussion you're having about unemployment. It seems to me that the sectors that are going to be hit hardest by people cutting back on discretionary spending are the sectors that were hit hardest by lockdowns. You know, by default, they are non-essential services because they were locked down. So some parts of retail, hospitality, leisure. But of course, so firstly, those businesses, those sectors might not be as financially robust coming into this crisis as they may have been otherwise. But also during the pandemic, we had things like furlough, etc., protecting kind of workers in those sectors. We obviously don't have that now. So is there a risk that we're underestimating the potential for employment kind of within those industries because the businesses are weaker and there's less support for them as well? And of course, a lot of those workers are low paid as well, so they'd be losing their jobs as costs are going up as well.
Yeah, no, I think that's an excellent point, and it's quite true that, you know, a lot of the sectors that will be affected will be similar ones to the one affected during the pandemic, and unemployment will go up. The Bank of England forecast, I can't remember the exact figures now, but it was certainly they are seeing unemployment will go up more in next year rather than this year, but it's certainly going to go up. So I think that will make those households quite. It will make them poorer, so it'll make things much harder for them. So I think you're quite right. Unemployment will rise, but I haven't seen the forecast for bigger rises in unemployment. But things may get worse, and you know, if supply chain shortages do get a lot worse because of the war or whatever, then that could lead to a big rise in unemployment. It's perfectly possible. It's perfectly possible.
And using Stefan's example, you know, those sectors that are so important to the Welsh economy, if your average family, your vulnerable family, but if families, let's say, go out less, that then is going to affect that hospitality industry that is also having to pay more for its sunflower oil. That is also, if it can get any. So, you know, it is quite a scary spiral, isn't it, Hugh?
It is quite a scary spiral, you know, I remember we were all a bit scared during the Great Financial Crisis. Remember, there was a lot of uncertainty there. This one has come up a little bit more slowly. I mean, as an economist, you know, we've been seeing the inflation coming along. It's sort of crept up a little more, but it is in a sense, if you became unemployed during the Great Financial Crisis, it had a great effect on your standard of living. People couldn't find jobs, so it did have an effect at the time. This one is going to be a bit more widespread and generalized, I think, but it certainly will affect certain households a lot more. But it is scary, yes. I mean, I think it's the worst prognosis I've seen for a while, really, what might happen. Yeah, certainly. And
we haven't talked about interest rates. You know, the Bank of England has already put up interest rates fairly steadily. It's sort of alluded to the fact it'll go higher. That's then another pressure, isn't it? Not just on families, but on the economy.
Yes.
How will that interact? I mean, that's the classic thing to do, isn't it? If you've got inflation, as you put up interest rates, we're all taught that at school. But doing that when there's very little growth, what effect does it have then?
Well, the way it's supposed to work is that you raise interest rates, you reduce demand, and that.
But we haven't got enough demand.
Well, we do have enough demand, but it's a supply side problem primarily, I think. It's a supply that's lacking. So in that sense, we do have enough demand, and that the inflation, if you like, is bringing back demand into equilibrium. But the question is, who is the demanders? Who is spending the money? That's the question. And if we have a very, very unequal society, this is another long run thing. Since the 1980s, our society is becoming more and more unequal. And so that, but the interest rate, they're only going to raise it a bit. I think the Bank of England itself is forecasting maybe 2.5%. Now, that will affect some people. If you have a big mortgage, that will affect you. If you've already paid off your mortgage, it won't affect you at all. And if you've
got loads of credit cards and a shopping card.
oh, don't worry. The credit cards are charging a fortune, an extortionate amount anyway. So they'll just keep on charging you 30%.
We have a question from someone not in the room.
Thanks. I'm going to try and do 3 questions and roll them into one, if that's okay. Paul Rock says, do you think it's about time now for Welsh Government local councils to create highly visible programmes of dig for victory type, get rid of your garden and start growing your own food? So that's one of them. Also a question about alternative measures of outcomes to an economy, happiness, wellness. Maybe you're delighted when you're digging up your garden, it's giving you a new sense of life. And my question is, did you in the 1970s go into a squat, Professor Hugh Dixon?
I think that's for later.
Yeah.
Well, no, I can answer that. I can answer that one very easily because I was living with my parents. I was living with my parents, so no need to squat.
So dig for victory. Should the Welsh Government be saying, in terms of the Future Generations Act, it fits perfectly, doesn't it? Because it would help people's well-being and their physical exercise, and they'd get free carrots or whatever.
Yes,
that's what they should be doing.
Definitely. As I say, when I was talking, helping farmers, they should certainly be helping farmers, but helping dig for victory. Why not? Why not do that?
But there is a big why not, because actually we don't have many people that with those skills or who want to.
Well, but they can still encourage people to do it. So that whether it'll have a big effect or not. I mean, let's remember in the past, school holidays used to be organised in Britain to go in with harvesting, so that school kids were going harvesting stuff. I mean, it's a long time ago, but it's not in my living memory, but certainly since the Second World War. So there is a possibility of doing things. We should be doing everything to help farmers that we can. And we should also be helping ourselves. And so helping people to grow stuff in their back garden. Why not, have a few pet pigs or something? I don't know, something like that, or chickens, yes. That would be great. So,
but food waste is phenomenal, isn't it? As you said, and that is something that surely the Welsh Government could help, or could they not? Do they not have the powers?
I'm not sure whether they have the powers, but they could. I mean, a lot of stuff is just thrown away. So even just collecting some food that's thrown away that's not suitable for we've got the wonky vegetables and things at Morrison's. There are community fridges
across Wales and things like that, aren't there? But there's a bit of stigma.
Well, just so long as there's more food, if you have to endure a little bit of stigma, it doesn't matter. And if you have a policy like Dig for Victory, the stigma will go away, I think, and people should get used to using strangely shaped carrots and chopping them up and so on. I mean, that never bothers me what shape a carrot looks like.
And in several of your responses, you've sort of said, you've talked about the long term and the medium term. For a lot of people, it's literally the kind of next few months they're really worried about, aren't they? I mean, I was talking to a family in a provincial town, a small town in Wales, for instance, where both parents work, they've got 3 children, they're in social housing, and the rent, so this isn't Cardiff or a city, in social housing, £690 a month, and that's in social housing. So how do those sort of people get, or people who basically spend all their money every month, which is a lot of people, not just the most vulnerable, how did they get through the next 9 months, let's say?
Well, I think for households like that, I mean, I think direct help. I mean, in the past, your housing costs used to be paid directly by the government. That changed. I can't remember when it was. Was it 10 years ago, 15 years ago?
Something like that, yeah.
Something like that. So, in the past, your housing costs, your rent, it was paid directly to the landlord by whoever it was that paid it. I can't even remember now. But by the government, should we say? And I think that was a good system, if you like. And for the very poorest households, I think the government could take that over, if only just for a temporary thing, so that people know they won't lose their homes, and that they will have enough money to get by with.
And messaging is going to be important, isn't it? Because you know, you were saying that we're going to be poorer, we're going to have less stuff, we're not, you know, and for some people that's more worrying than others. How, if you ruled the world, if you were a prime minister, how do you say to a nation, you're going to be worse off? Because already that was a problem in terms of asking people to reduce consumption because of climate change. So how do you say we're going to be worse off for a couple of years and then it'll be okay?
Well, I'm not a politician.
No, and you're really glad you're not. I'm glad I'm not too.
No, I'm not. But you know, to some level, you know, the truth needs to be told at some stage. People need to realise this. I think people often think, well, the government will somebody is going to sort something out. They can't let this happen.
And that's part of the problem with furlough. We got into that mindset, didn't we? That basically, if there's something terrible, the government will step in and. Yes.
So I think the government could borrow more money, but that's a bit of a potentially a poison chalice. They've got to be quite careful with that. But I mean, I think there is an inflation, so I think there is something they can do to help out the poorest households. But in general, I just think people will be worse off for a couple of years, and you know, that's the message that needs to be sent out. I mean, to pretend otherwise is really just to mislead the public. But of course, politicians have very short. They have even shorter time horizons. They're just looking to the next election. So, you know, often they just say things which are needed for now.
Well, we don't want to depress everybody too much at the beginning of a day, do we? So, but you do think that this is literally a couple of years?
A year to 2 years. Yes, I think so. Well, I mean, the supply chain shortages. China will end its COVID policy. It'll return back to the Ukraine events. They will resolve themselves somehow. You know, alternative supply arrangements will come up, and supply will be restored around the world. So I think yes, but it'll take a little bit of time for all these adjustments to be made.
Gentlemen here.
Thank you very much. Families. Oh, sorry, I'm waiting for my.
Yeah, sorry.
Peter Badcock, thank you very much. I keep hearing this word families, but I'm missing another group, and that's pensioners, who seem to be getting stuck because they can't actually put their hand up and demand a 20% pension increase. Have you any comments, please?
Yes. No, pensioners, it's interesting. You're completely right. 20 or 30 years ago, pensioners were one of the poorest groups in society. And we'd always be talking about pensioners when we talk about the poorest. And of course, pensioners, you know, are particularly affected by this energy. You need to keep warm when you're older, and so on. So pensioners are affected by this more. I think there is a reason we hear a bit less about them, because there's a tale of two sets of pensioners. There's some sets of pensioners who are on defined benefit schemes, index-linked benefit schemes, index-linked to RPI, which is even higher. That's 10%. That's already 10%, and they're doing okay. Thank you. But then there are other pensioners who aren't, and they're in a different situation. So yes, you're right. Amongst the poorest households, I would put pensioners, because they're single person or maybe two-person households without kids. But yes, certainly pensioners, a certain portion segment of pensioners, those without defined benefit pensions and all that sort of stuff, they would be amongst this poorest groups. I don't want to leave them out, certainly. And of course, you know, the need to keep warm and so on for health reasons makes them even more dependent on energy. You know, if you're 25 years old and you switch the heating off and you're a bit cold, it's one thing. But you know, if you're 90 and you do that, then it's another thing.
Well, Hugh, thank you very much. Thank you for your question. I think we'll draw that to a close because John is amongst us.
I'm hovering, which means that it's time to draw things to a close. So thank you so much, both of you. Hugh, probably not the most cheerful breakfast briefing we've had, but thank you, Hugh. Very comprehensive. Sarah, thank you so much for joining us as well this morning. You're welcome at all of our breakfast briefings. You can see the professional way that that's been handled this morning. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Diolch yn fawr iawn I chi gyd am fod efo ni bore yma. Gobeithio fawr fyddwn ni yn eich gweld chi eto cyn bo hir. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. Hopefully we'll see you at one of our breakfast briefings before too long. But have a great day and we'll see you again soon. Thank you.